If you have an interest in horses and love learning more about horses, the horse industry, teaching, or even managing your own horse business, then you're in the right place. We would love you to join us on our mission, which is to improve the lives of horses around the world through the education of riders, handlers, and trainers. So get comfortable, listen in, and enjoy.
This has been another episode sponsored by Online Horse College. If you haven't had a look at the wide variety of equine-specific accredited courses, then go to onlinehorsecollege.com and I'll see you over there. We've got another regular guest back today on Horse Chats, but first of all, I'd like to just remind you about Sophie Barrington and Archer Creative. They're the experts in equine business marketing. So if you're looking for copywriting, public relations, social media, email marketing, graphic design or website design, then contact Sophie at Archer Creative. So if you're frustrated by a low return on investment from your marketing efforts, she's the person to go to. Best way to contact her is go to horsechats.com, search for Sophie, search for Barrington or search for Archer Creative and you'll find her. Now, back to our interview today, or our chat today. Our regular guest is Peter Huntington. Now, if you haven't heard of Peter before, you need to go back and listen to a couple of his earlier chats, especially, I think the first one's good because that gives you a bit of background, but the second one as well was just the 10 rules of feeding, and they were just really good basic rules that come back. So now we're going on to do some specialist tips, and I think we've got 10 feeding considerations for horses with gastrointestinal disorders today. How are you today, Peter?
Great, thanks.
Great.
Yeah, that's really good.
Good. Is that right, Peter? We're going to do the feeding considerations for horses with gastrointestinal disorders?
Well, I'm probably trying to prevent gastrointestinal disorders might be a better topic there.
Yes, probably is, yes. Tell us a little bit about the background in that.
Well, the horse's gastrointestinal system's quite a bit different to that of humans or other animals. And so the sort of some of the feeds we use and the feeding practices and feeding management needs to be different because of that. So we've got the horse has a small stomach, and feed moves quickly through it. The stomach is prone to gastric ulcers. That's become more obvious. People have got longer endoscopes that find many horses are affected with gastric ulcers. And we've got a small intestine which is a big, long, thin tube, 20 metres long or something like that. And that's the site of digestion of many carbohydrates, protein, absorption of minerals and vitamins, so a key part of it. And then we move into the large intestine, the cecum and the colon, which is sort of like a big fermentation vat, a bit like the rumen of the cow and the sheep, and that's where there's sort of billions of bacteria and protozoa that are fermenting fibre, and the health of that bacterial population is certainly linked with the health of the horse.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Do you think we're more aware of now gastrointestinal disorders because of the ability to scope horses and the more awareness to it?
I think we are because of the awareness about gastric ulcers. I think what we don't know is what the gastric ulcers mean. I mean, some horses look absolutely healthy and have got quite significant ulcers. So we're sort of still, and we know some of the risk factors about gastric ulcers, but we're still wrestling with that in areas where probably a lot of horses have got hindgut disturbances, and that might be identified in sort of research about the microbiota. And people who are aware of the links of that with human health would be aware that, we can have the same sort of thing in horses, but we're still a long way from knowing all we need to know about that area of the gut. But, people do recognise, obviously, colic is one of the big, the big things that they want to have a low risk of and a low incidence of. And if you've got horses that are prone to colic, then it's a big issue. So, yeah.
Okay, well, we'll get on to the first point you've got, and you've sort of given us a good overview, but understanding the horse's gastrointestinal system.
Yeah, well, I think I've sort of, probably just covered that in terms of understanding anatomy, physiology. It's probably, the full scope of that is beyond the scope of this podcast. So some of the people who want to know more about it
might have to go to a veterinary lecture or something, yeah.
Yeah, veterinary lecture or could do some reading. I mean, our Equinews website, there's good articles there about some of the setup of the gastrointestinal system. But if you look at, moving, feeding principles for optimal gut health, would be things like don't change feeds too rapidly. So horses are, unlike humans, they're creatures of habit in terms of what they eat. So their bacterial population becomes accustomed to that. And if you change them, then that's sort of upsetting the bacterial population. Small meals, particularly with concentrates, giving them enough fibre. The gastrointestinal tract, particularly the large intestine, needs fibre, has a need for fibre, and they're going to get that fibre from pasture, from hay, from chaff, maybe from super fibres, and perhaps from the concentrate feed, but making sure that they've got enough forage in their diet to supply the fibre.
Yep.
That's an important part of it. Others are related to meal size of concentrates, so keeping meal sizes down, keeping the starch content down. Things like the processing, if you're using grains, making sure that they're adequately processed, and the heat processing, oats don't need processing, but barley and corn do. Lupins need processing for horses to chew them, effectively. But having adequate amount of processing if the ingredient needs processing. They're some of the important feeding principles, I think, for optimal gut health. And also looking at the sort of group dynamics. If you're feeding horses in groups, making sure that one horse isn't gutsing everything, so and the other horse getting left out.
Perfect. All right. So that was number 2, the feeding principles for optimum gut health. Number 3 now is a common problem. Or number 1 is colic, and we often talk about colic right through, sort of pony club exams. We start talking about colic and what the problem it is. It really is a big problem with horses. So can you talk about that?
A little bit. Colic is one of the bigger killers of horses, and if horses need to go to surgery, then that's very expensive, and it's one of the things that you're aware of. Now, feeding has some impact on the risk factors for colic. There are a number of others, and sometimes it's just unknown what the risk factor is. But some horses go through their life without colic, and some horses are more prone to colic and seem to get it more often, and some sort of management systems are more likely to have colic than not. Mm-hmm. But it's certainly, colic and laminitis are probably, 2 of the real big bugbears that facing horse health.
Yeah. So can you tell us, that's number 4, is the colic symptoms, causes and diagnosis?
Yeah, the colic symptoms can be quite varied, and can involve, colic is another word for abdominal pain. So the horse has got a pain in the abdomen, and that can come from a wide variety of areas, and the symptoms and can be, differing severity. It could be just not eating. It could be, failing to pass any droppings in the case of impaction. It may be significant pain that's evidenced by things like high heart rates, by sweating, by rolling, flank watching, kicking at the belly, all that sort of thing. So there's a wide variety of signs, and colic is something that should be treated very seriously. And I think it's a veterinary emergency. So if you've got a horse with colic and it's going to resolve quickly, you need to be getting the vet to look at your horse, and then they are going to sort of conduct some examinations to try and determine the severity and which type of colic it might be, and therefore what to do about it.
Good. Now, feeding horses, and I know that you're the feeding specialist, so feeding horses after colic is point number 5.
Yeah, I guess that's a big topic, because it depends on the type of colic.
Yep.
And if a horse that's had surgery is going to have different feeding practices to what you might do for a horse that's just had a medical colic that's either resolved without veterinary treatment or with sort of symptomatic type veterinary treatment. But in general terms, the things that are risk factors for colic are probably that relate to feed are high intakes of concentrate feed. They are indigestible forages that might lead to impaction. They are things like feedstuffs that are prone to fermentation and production of a lot of gas. So that could be highly fermentable pastures and really high-quality pastures. And low fibre intakes. They're some of the things that come to mind, and changes of feed. Mm-hmm. So in terms of, feeding after colic, if you've got to look at, what the type of colic is as to what you might change. So, there's no one-size-fits-all in this regard. Okay. And so you've got to look at, what's the type of colic, and therefore, what are the feeding practices, what risks do we have involved, and what we might do as a consequence of that. So it depends on the type of colic that the horse has, the severity, and then, did it resolve with medical treatment or did it need surgery? Because feeding practices after surgery are very different to what you might do medically. Mm-hmm. Sometimes people can just, continue on and feed the horse exactly the same way that were fed before, but other times they might need to then look at some change if it's identified that there are risk factors that I've outlined earlier.
Okay. So you talked then about other feeding considerations. So have we covered point number 6, feeding considerations for preventing colic?
Yeah, I think we have, because it's a matter of I think in many ways trying to keep the feeding as natural as possible, with high enough forage intakes, mm-hmm. But feeding good quality forage. But sometimes the risk factor can be, in fact, forage that's too high a quality. So if you've got superpowered grass with lots of indigestible fructans that can contribute to disturbances in the bacterial population, then we get gas production, and that can be one of the risks for colic. So it's very much a horses for courses in terms of identifying what the likely risk factors are related to that type of colic, and then taking the considerations in terms of meal size, processed grains, amount of fibre, quality of the fibre, mm-hmm. These sort of availability of feed into consideration. So, a number of things you need to consider.
Okay. Now, common problem number 2 is the hindgut acidosis. Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, well, hindgut acidosis is thought to be one of the risk factors for colic. And hindgut acidosis, we're talking about the large intestine, the cecum and the colon there. And when, as I've said earlier, there's billions of bacteria and protozoa that are there, and their job is to ferment the fibre. And as part of that fibre, they produce volatile fatty acids that are then digested, absorbed, and they're a source of energy. But in the right, or shall we say the wrong circumstances, the bacteria have excessive amounts of carbohydrates to ferment, and that can produce different types of acids, such as lactic acid. Now, those carbohydrates can come from undigested starches, from unprocessed grain or meal size that's too big or not being chewed effectively, or it can come from fructans in pasture. And the fructans are indigestible sugars that you have in pasture, and they pass through the large intestine. So then we've got acid production, and the acid production then changes the nature of the bacterial population, and so we get a preponderance of bacteria that like a lower pH. Mm-hmm. And taken to extremes, that can be one of the considerations in cases of laminitis related to either grain overload or really super high quality pastures. So that's what's happening in hindgut acidosis. Difficult to measure, and there can be a variety of signs. And so I'll move on to the symptoms.
This is point number 8. Yes, the symptoms, causes, and diagnosis. Yep.
Symptoms of hindgut acidosis, and it may well be that that's loose manure, so you get a increase in the water content, change in the smell, sort of loose, sort of foul-smelling manure, change in the smell because of the change in the bacterial population. In extreme cases, we've got sort of laminitis that can result from it, and colic can result. But in more moderate cases, it might be things like behaviour change, because it does seem that hindgut health and hindgut stability can be linked with behaviour. And horses that are a bit unsettled or fractious, that can settle down when they've got a more settled hindgut. So it's sort of a bit of a saying that a happy gut is a happy horse, and that can come from both gastric ulcers and hindgut acidosis. Diagnostically, yes, you can measure pH of the manure. It's more accurate if you measure pH of the contents of the cecum and the colon, but that's practically that's impossible. You can measure that pH, and that can give you a bit of a guide as to what's going on. It's meant to be close to 7, which is neutral, but in some circumstances is getting down, and when it gets below 6, we're starting to see some sort of damage. The other thing I didn't mention is that when you get chronic sort of hindgut disturbances and acidosis, that can change the bacterial population and just reduce the efficiency of digestion, so that the horse needs more feed to maintain its body condition, because the hindgut digestive processes are not as efficient. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the other considerations there.
Yep. Well, we're talking about feeding. So number 9 is feeding horses with hindgut acidosis. So if you can go into a bit more depth there about the feeding.
Yeah, the preventative practices. So what we're looking at there is, minimising, giving the horse enough fibre.
Yep.
So the fibre, and that's, we talk about minimum amounts of forage that the horse might need. Is the desirable be 1.5% of body weight, and absolute minimum is 1% of body weight. So that's giving them enough fibre there, and having the fibre in front of them. The second is minimising the amount of undigested carbohydrate that gets to the large intestine. Now that may relate to the amount of starch in the feed, the processing of the source of the starch, the processing of the grains. It's one of the reasons why we don't feed wheat to horses, because it's very high starch, and unless it's processed, it's not very well digested. So we're sort of minimising the amount of starch that gets there, or minimising the amount of sugar that gets there. And if we've got horses on high quality pastures, particularly sunny days, then the fructan levels rise during the day, and this is not digested, so it's in the small intestine, so it goes in and is fermented to produce acidosis. So in certain horses, you've just got to say, okay, we can't expose the horse to, we need to reduce the exposure of the horse to that high quality pasture and that fructans. And there are also some other considerations you can have in sort of hindgut buffers. So we have a product, Ethel, which is an encapsulated sodium bicarbonate, and that's designed to get through the normal digestive process in the stomach and the small intestine, and to be available in the large intestine to buffer the acid and keep the pH up. And quite nice data showing that occurs, and therefore that will have an influence on the lactic acid content, which is the contributor to the hindgut acidosis. Mm-hmm. So there's a number of factors in there. Yeast culture potentially also is something that may have some small impact. So horses prone to hindgut disturbances, then you need to look at what dietary considerations are there that require modification to reduce the risk.
Okay. So you've sort of covered really that number 10 was the feeding consideration for preventing the hindgut acidosis. Yeah, you're a bit ahead of me today, Peter. I think you're, you know what you're talking about. I'm trying to dissect it and listen and go, right, well, where are we up to? So, yeah, look, as usual, brilliant talk. I think, from someone who's absolutely an expert in this area. Love having you on the show and looking forward to getting you back again. I think for people who'd like to get those 10 feeding considerations to prevent horses from getting gastrointestinal disorders, those tips will be on our website, which will be horsechats.com/Peter Huntington. I don't know, Peter, about number 5 by now, but if you just search for Peter Huntington, you'll find his page and you'll find the summary of those 10 points. Contact details, if you can talk about your contact details. And also too, earlier on, you talked about Equinews for people who would like to get a bit more information about that, understanding the horse's gastrointestinal system. So if you can talk about where they can get Equinews and also your contact details, please.
Sure. Equinews.com is the website, or they can go to our main website, kar.com, and go to the library section of that. And you can find there'll be hundreds of articles about gastrointestinal health and some of the disorders associated with it, and certainly some of the things around, more specifics, more detail than we can put in this particular podcast.
Yep.
So equinews.com or kar.com. And as far as contacting us, if they have got a horse that's prone to colic or prone to hindgut disturbances and want some advice on how to identify the risk factors or manage those risk factors, then either 1-800-772-198 or by emailing advice@kar.com, and we'll try and help people look after the gastrointestinal health of their horse better and have a happier, healthier horse.
Perfect. So thanks, Peter. Thanks for coming on today, and looking forward to catching up with you again.
Great, Glenys. Thanks very much.
Okay, bye. Now, if you're still there, you probably know that I'm absolutely passionate about education within the horse industry. That's why I host this podcast. My other venture is Online Horse College. Have a look now at onlinehorsecollege.com, and I'll see you over there.
Remember that our comments and instructions are general in nature and do not take into consideration your individual horses or your individual ability and circumstances. If you enjoyed this podcast, then please leave your comment below.